Thank you for that introduction. As I've said, my name is Asher Judah. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Victorian Division of the Property Council. For those who don't know, the Property Council represents Australia's property owners, investors, developers and service providers. We represent collectively $600 billion industry, and the Victorian Division is the second largest of those statewide, nationally. Feel free to tweet about my presentation, only positive comments of course, but there are the details there if you want to add it to your Twitter account. What I'll be talking about to you today is the future of local government regarding some of the biggest challenges that I think you face. As outlined by the previous speaker, we see one of the biggest challenges being housing Melbourne over the next 40 years. I'm going to be talking about the importance of urban renewal, local government's role in delivering urban renewal, what drives it, both the supply and the demand side, what urban renewal should be taking place, where is it taking place, what policies are required to improve outcomes in that area, and also our vision for local government's future in this space. As you know, Melbourne's population is growing. It's 4.2 million at the moment. In 40 years, it will be 6.5 million. That's an extra 2.3 million people we need to house. Now, fitting them in within Melbourne's boundaries will be difficult. Some people will not be happy with how that changes our city, but it is a reality, and there are two approaches to doing it. There's detached housing, which mainly goes out on the fringe, and housing in established areas, and that is what we're going to be talking about here, urban renewal. Urban renewal, in more of a technical term, and I think this helps clarify, it relates to a shift in the nature and characteristics of a neighbourhood through the effects of infrastructure and property redevelopment. It encompasses residential, commercial, office, retail and other forms of private and public property. It's an evolutionary process common to all cities around the world, and it is how they cope with change, remain modern and functional. Melbourne at 5 million, which is one of the many planning documents we seem to see every 4 or 5 years, set an annual urban renewal target of 53% of all new dwellings being built in established areas. Now, these are the statistics that the Property Council has gathered over the period where either Melbourne at 5 million was being developed or has actually been in effect. So between 2005 and 2011, only 18% of new dwellings were built in established areas, and it's about 39,000 there. The forecast for the next 2.5 years is 47%, and it's a forecast, so things can change, but we're fairly confident that something close to that will be met. But what's obvious is that we haven't come anywhere near close to the urban renewal targets that Melbourne at 5 million sets out, and we've been pulling 22% across Melbourne for those 9 years. Now, local government's role in this space is extremely important. We see local government being a key driver and deliverer of these outcomes. Why? Well, local government has important responsibilities in the planning system. You're tasked with facilitating the nation's and the state's growth strategies. And it's a difficult position, we understand, because a lot of community groups, certainly councillors, different councils, don't like those strategies. With the Property Council, our view is that it's a national decision. It's often a state decision, and unfortunately local government is tasked with the delivery of it, whether they agree with it or not. You guys set the rules by which urban renewal can occur through your planning frameworks. You manage the majority of the planning process. As you know, you provide infrastructure and amenity in partnership with state and Commonwealth, perhaps not as much as you would like, but you do work in that area. And important to note, and this is something we're going to talk about a lot more to ease some of the pressure on your councils, is that not all local governments have the same obligations in this space. Some have higher pressures based on their geography, based on their proximity to Melbourne, and others just have different capabilities. So what drives urban renewal? These will all be pretty obvious to you, as I'm sure you'll know. Site availability, the planning frameworks, not just the statutory controls, but also the public attitudes to them. Availability of finance and the risk and return in the area. The demand side issues, it's mainly about amenity and transport, whether it's a good place to live, whether it's attractive, whether the clientele who want to live in apartments and urban renewal type projects like the area and think it's suitable, whether it's easy to get to employment from that location, and of course the cost of entering it. And the next few slides I've got show a map of Greater Melbourne and where urban renewal has been taking place, where it should take place. So I'll take some time between each slide so you have an opportunity to absorb it. You should be able to see the key which details those slides, but if you have any questions or you need me to explain it, just raise your hand and I'll try and help you out. So this slide shows you where urban renewal, in our view, should take place. It's an apartment location suitability ratio. Basically, the darker the area, the more suitable it is for apartments to be built. So as you can see, it is along the channels between the major train lines in the inner suburbs, extending into the middle ring suburbs. The further out you go, the less appropriate it is. There are exceptions based on infill and infrastructure, but I think it gives you a good idea as to where urban renewal should be taking place at this point based on infrastructure, etc. This next slide is a continuation of the previous one, but it talks about location suitability versus actual supply. So it's crossing both of those items. So the areas that are best suited for urban renewal are the blue ones. No surprises there, but as you'll see that if you go a little bit further out, Box Hill, for example, you'll find there are a few outliers outside the inner suburbs where there's an opportunity to put urban renewal in without totally disrupting the neighbourhood character, and in fact, in some cases, improving it. This next slide talks about where we see the opportunities for development in this space. This details commercial scale development of urban renewal, which means something over 6 stories. Basically, the unions turn up when you go over a certain height limit, and it changes the cost dynamic of the project. And it also changes the length of the project, supply, OHS requirements become considerably more complicated. The working day calendar changes considerably. In domestic, if you're building under 3 stories, you can work a different sort of week, whereas commercial is very regimented, and it changes, as I said, the cost structures. So this one tells you where the price ratio for a 1-bedroom apartment is less than 50% of the median estimated home. So say that once more. It's where the price ratio for a 1-bedroom apartment is less than 50% of the median estimated home. So as you can see, some areas where there isn't a lot of development actually make the most sense to build apartments, and as you can see, it extends into the Bayside area where we don't have a lot of urban renewal. But sorry, question? Well, it depends where you build it, and depends how many stories you build. The higher you go, the more you can divide the cost over the project. It's a difficult question because it's how long's a piece of string. If you're building in the docklands and you're building 30, 40 stories, the cost of the apartment will drop per apartment. Whereas if you're building 6 stories in Bayside, well, the cost of the apartment will go up. So that's why builders and developers push for more height, because their margin. As I said, it does vary, $400,000 to $600,000. But I stress it does vary based on where you're building. Sometimes, it depends on where you are in the EBA cycle for commercial construction, and that can change your costs quite considerably. This next slide is about domestic construction. So this is 3 levels or below. So it is urban renewal, but it's bigger townhouses, short apartments. Not necessarily, some will have lifts, some might not. And it's slightly, I'll flick back to the previous slide in a second once you've had a chance to absorb this. It's slightly different because the economics are different. I'll flick back now. It's a little bit of a change. Certainly, I think in Manningham you'll see there's a bit of a colour change there, where there's different opportunities. So where is urban renewal occurring? Now this is thanks. This is a map of what has been happening over the last 6.5 years. The areas in blue, no surprise, are where the bulk of the apartments and infill and urban renewal is occurring. Then you extend into the orange, the green, and then the pink. So most of you will be familiar with that if you're in those council areas. There's a few outliers, as you can see. The one in the northeast, that's Bundoora. That was a large release of government land, and that triggered a spike, which is unusual. It's not the best area in terms of in terms of supply and amenity, because it isn't built yet or isn't developed up enough to suit the demand. But it is probably the one exception in regards to Melbourne. Now this gives you some harder numbers as to where the apartments are being built in regards to the suburbs. You can see who the leaders are there, no surprises really. Melbourne, South Bank, Docklands and South Yarra. Then we move into Port Melbourne, Richmond, and as I said, Bundoora and North Melbourne, they've spiked a little bit outside their normal range. Now the three vertical columns, apartments, suburb, it breaks it down a little bit so you have some idea as to what's being built where. Medium density, detached. Medium density would just be halfway between a skyscraper and a detached home, closer to the detached home size and site, but it gives you some cross-section idea. This next slide is based on councils, and I think it can be more useful to you. It talks about who met the urban renewal targets that Melbourne at 5 million suggested. So take a bow, Melbourne, Port Phillip, Stonington and Yarra. They've largely done what they were hoped to do. I think Port Phillip just came a bit under, 611, but they're definitely taking care of that in the years going forward. So I'll let you, if people want to take some notes, I'll give it a second, so you've got the chance to grab that. But I think it will also, this might be posted on the website later, I'm not sure. So I'll find out for you. As you can see, the further out you go, the less likely these targets are met. The demand is a part of that, but a lot of it also comes down to local government attitudes to development. I think it's important that this information be circulated because councils like Stonington, Yarra, Port Phillip, and even Boroondara, they regularly get beaten up as being anti-development. And these figures show that they're not. It's not always justified. It might be a good story, but there are some champions out there pulling their weight, and certainly pulling the weight ahead of some of the other councils that either aren't familiar with urban renewal, that aren't familiar with the benefits of it, or just can't see how it can work locally given their infrastructure needs. So what reforms are required? How do we improve urban renewal outcomes? Well, we at Property Council favour a carrot and stick approach. The carrots being incentives, financial incentives for meeting quotas. The national competition payments were a great way of getting the state governments to do what they didn't want to do. It didn't always work, but it did in some sectors, and we think that's something state governments need to start doing. And certainly the federal government may need to help provide the money to drive that sort of change. There's a lot of Canberra-based city project, urban development bureaucrats looking for something to do. We think that is something that area they can work in. It's easy to put out a document saying this is what we should do, but if you want to drive the change, you're going to have to pay for it. And we recognise that, and we think local government can be incentivised in this space. We also think infrastructure funding tied to density increases is also another way to go. If the council you work with simply says there's no way we can accommodate 1,000 more apartments here, everything's a traffic jam in peak hour, well then something needs to be done to fix infrastructure. We know you don't have the money, so someone should provide the money to get that outcome. So these carrots are about working towards an outcome. In regards to sticks, one thing that frustrates our membership is when councils don't comply with their own planning frameworks. They say this is what you can do. It goes through the planning system and then it gets rejected by council due to politics or a range of other issues. We think there should be penalties applied to councils that do that. It's incredibly frustrating. It's extremely costly for developers, and I think unfortunately there's an attitude in Melbourne that if you're a developer, you're wealthy, and therefore you can cop the frustration and the cost of having a failed application. I don't think that's the way to go, and it certainly doesn't help with Melbourne's development. And it forces developers to pursue a VCAT option, and I think it certainly reduces the dialogue that's necessary. Another alternative, which is the last resort, which is state government intervention. And that's talked about from time to time, where council simply will not accommodate what needs to be done. We don't want to go down that path, but we see that happening down the track if we don't meet these renewal targets. Now, councils which meet their quotas, well, I think we need to do more to congratulate them, promote them and reward them as the leaders amongst their peers. Conversely, those that don't, we need to spend more time persuading them, educating and encouraging them to pursue this path. I don't think it's about beating everybody up. So that's the approach we'd like to take from the property council point of view. So what we would like to see local government do in the future and what we want to help local government achieve is better financial support to manage urban renewal and growth, making growth work for the community. I think Andrea mentioned it earlier, growth doesn't have to be a bad thing. You know, Paris, if those familiar with the city of Paris, Paris was rubbish in the mid-18th century. Baron van Haussmann changed it, turned it into one of the most beautiful cities on earth. 80 million people visit it every year as tourists. They do it because it's now functional. It wasn't back then. The reform process was messy, but growth and change and urban renewal really is what unleashed it. And I think there's an opportunity for Melbourne in that space. We also want to help share the responsibility of growth with the community and builders. Urban renewal targets being met to improve Melbourne's livability. Predictable planning outcomes for stakeholders. This is important for us. It's okay for a planning framework to say no development, because then we don't actually go through the process of trying to get development up. We know we can't get it up. But when it says a council's in favour of it and then it fails, that's when people get upset. We'd like a less adversarial planning system which minimises costs for all. We'd like to work cooperatively with local government to educate and inform decision makers and voters, and I think that's something where we can do a lot better. And we'd like to maintain a regular and respectful dialogue, and that's one of the reasons we're here today, to help get to know each other, see where our common ground is and improve the outcomes for all. So thank you for the opportunity today, and I think I'll be answering questions at the panel later if you have any.